Part 1. The House on Alder Court. I bought my house on Alder Court 14 months before any of this started, a modest 3-bedroom I'd saved toward for the better part of a decade, and I want to begin this account by telling you how genuinely happy I was there, in the ordinary, unremarkable months before everything changed, because I think that happiness matters for understanding exactly how much was actually taken from me, beyond the obvious, immediate danger of what I'm about to describe. My name is Perpetua, friends call me Percy, and I'll use that here, since it's the name I still recognize as belonging to the person I was before all of this, and I worked, at the time, as a pediatric occupational therapist, a job I loved, in a small city I'd chosen specifically because it felt safe, walkable, the kind of place where neighbors still waved from porches and a woman living alone didn't attract much particular notice. I mention all of this not out of nostalgia for its own sake, but because I think it's important that you understand I was not living carelessly, was not ignoring obvious warning signs, was not, in any way I can identify even now with the full benefit of hindsight, inviting what eventually happened to me. I want to describe that house itself briefly, because I think its specific, hard-won ordinariness matters to this account. It was a modest craftsman-style home built in the 1930s, original hardwood floors I'd spent an entire summer refinishing myself, a small garden out back where I'd slowly, patiently coaxed a genuinely thriving vegetable patch out of soil that had been neglected for years before I bought the place. I'd furnished it slowly, deliberately, room by room, over the 14 months I'd lived there, each piece chosen with a care that reflected, I think, how much that house represented to me, not just shelter, but a genuine, hard-earned achievement. Proof of a decade of careful saving and disciplined choices finally paying off into something entirely my own. It started with the locksmith's invoice. I'd had my locks rekeyed when I first bought the house, standard practice, the kind of thing any careful new homeowner does without a second thought, and I'd kept the invoice in a drawer with the rest of my closing paperwork, mostly forgotten. Until the afternoon I found it sitting, inexplicably, on my kitchen counter rather than in the drawer where I was certain I'd filed it. I remember standing there for a long moment, genuinely more puzzled than alarmed, running through the mundane possibilities. Had I moved it myself during some cleaning spree I didn't clearly remember? Had a visiting friend gone through that drawer for some innocent reason and simply left it out? Neither explanation fully satisfied me, but neither seemed alarming enough, on its own, to justify the unease already settling in my chest. The invoice itself told me something I hadn't fully processed when I'd first filed it away over a year earlier. My locksmith's paperwork noted, in a standard disclosure most homeowners never think twice about, that 3 keys had been cut during that initial service call, one for me, one for my sister who occasionally watered my plants when I traveled, and one additional key the locksmith's notes described only as spare, per customer request, a request I had absolutely no memory of ever making. Part 2. The 3rd key. I called the locksmith company the following morning, and the woman who answered, after checking their records, confirmed the invoice's details, but could offer no further explanation. The technician who'd handled my original service call had left the company over a year earlier, and their records, while confirming 3 keys had indeed been cut, gave no indication of who might have requested or received that 3rd one. Whether it had simply been an administrative error, a habit of overcutting keys for inventory purposes, or something considerably more deliberate. I remember pressing her for more detail than she was able to give, my voice rising slightly in a way that clearly made her uncomfortable, and I remember, too, the specific shame I felt afterward, apologizing for my tone, still, at that point, more embarrassed by my own alarm than genuinely convinced it was warranted. I want to be honest that I did the responsible things in the days that followed. I had my locks rekeyed again, this time watching every step of the process myself, standing in my own doorway while a different technician from a different company worked, counting the keys he handed me at the end with an obsessiveness that embarrassed me even as I did it. I mentioned the incident, in passing, to my sister Delphine, who lived 20 minutes away and had always been the more anxious of the two of us, and I watched her expression shift from casual interest into genuine concern as I described it, a shift that, In hindsight, I wish I'd taken considerably more seriously in the moment. For almost 3 weeks after the rekeying, nothing further happened, and I allowed myself, gradually, to relax back into the ordinary rhythms of my life, work, evenings with friends, the small, comfortable routines of a single woman genuinely content in a house she'd worked hard to earn. I want you to understand that this relaxation was not naivety. It was, I think, simply the ordinary human tendency to let vigilance fade once a specific, discrete threat appears to have resolved itself, a tendency that every single account like mine I've since read seems to describe in almost identical terms. Right before the moment, everything escalates again. The second sign came on a Tuesday evening in late October, when I returned home from a late shift to find my living room furniture rearranged, not dramatically, not obviously, but subtly enough that only someone who spent as much time in that room as I did would have noticed it all. My reading chair, which I always angled toward the window for afternoon light, had been turned instead to face directly toward my front door. I stood in that doorway for a long time, keys still in my hand, running through every possible mundane explanation and finding, this time, that none of them held up to even brief scrutiny. I lived alone. Nobody else had a key, not since the rekeying. And yet my chair had moved, deliberately, into a position that felt, standing there considering it, less like an accident and more like a message. I want to describe the specific, disorienting quality of standing in that doorway, because I think it's a feeling that doesn't translate well secondhand unless you've lived through something similar yourself. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. Not in that first moment. It was closer to a kind of vertigo, the specific sensation of the ground shifting slightly under a reality you'd trusted completely. I walked through the rest of the house that night with a flashlight, checking every closet, every space behind every door, finding nothing, no other sign of disturbance, which somehow made the single moved chair considerably more unsettling than a ransacked house would have been. A ransacked house tells a simple story. Someone broke in, took what they wanted, left. A single moved chair tells a story that requires you to imagine someone standing quietly in your home, taking their time, making one small, deliberate change, and leaving everything else exactly as they found it, which meant, whoever it was, they weren't interested in anything I owned. They were interested in me. Part 3. What the police couldn't do. I called the non-emergency police line that same night, and I want to describe the specific, frustrating texture of that first interaction, because I think it matters for understanding why so many accounts like mine describe victims eventually stopping their attempts to seek official help at all. The responding officer was polite, thorough within the narrow scope of what he was actually equipped to investigate, and ultimately, unavoidably, unable to offer much beyond a formal report and a recommendation that I consider a home security system. There's no sign of forced entry, he told me, standing in my living room, examining my rekeyed locks with the practiced, slightly weary attention of someone who'd delivered this same assessment many times before. No broken windows, no pried door frames, nothing that suggests anyone actually got in through conventional means. I believe you that the chair moved. I'm just telling you, from an investigative standpoint, we don't have much to work with here beyond your own account of the furniture's position. I understood his position, even as it frustrated me. I could see, watching him fill out his report, exactly how thin this would look to anyone reviewing it later. A single moved chair, no forced entry, no witnesses. Nothing that rose to the level of an actionable crime under any framework his department actually had available to it. He was not unkind about it. He simply had nothing more substantial to offer than a case number and a genuine, if somewhat rote, recommendation that I take my own safety more seriously going forward, advice that felt, in the moment, both obviously correct and completely inadequate to the specific, creeping dread I was actually experiencing. I installed the security system within the week, cameras at both entrances, a monitored alarm system, motion sensors covering my most vulnerable ground floor windows, a genuinely significant investment that I told myself, installing it, was simply prudent rather than an admission of how frightened I'd actually become. For almost a month, the system showed nothing unusual at all, every entry properly logged, every motion event traceable to my own movements or the occasional neighborhood cat, and I began, once again, to let myself believe the worst might genuinely be behind me. It was the cameras themselves that eventually proved both my vindication and the deepening of my fear. Reviewing footage after a particularly unsettling night where I'd woken at 3 in the morning with the specific, wordless certainty that something in my house had changed, I found, in the recorded footage from my living room camera, a gap, not a malfunction. Not a glitch, but a clean, deliberate 11-minute stretch where the recording simply resumed from a slightly different angle than it had been at when the gap began, the kind of discontinuity that suggested, according to the security company's own technical support when I called them in a panic, that the camera itself had been physically adjusted and then returned to a position close to, but not exactly matching, its original placement. I remember sitting at my kitchen table that morning, replaying that gap over and over, trying to make my own eyes find some innocent explanation in the footage's slight angle shift. The way you might stare at an optical illusion trying to force it back into the shape you originally expected. It never resolved into anything innocent. The angle before the gap and the angle after simply did not match, off by perhaps 4 or 5 degrees, an adjustment small enough that I might genuinely never have noticed it at all if I hadn't already been primed, by the chair, by the invoice, to look at my own home with the specific, exhausting suspicion of someone who no longer trusted it to hold still. That's not something that happens through any software error we're aware of, the technician told me, and I remember the specific chill of hearing him say it, because it meant, unmistakably, that whoever was doing this had been inside my house again. During those 11 minutes, close enough to physically handle my own security equipment, in a house whose locks had been changed, whose alarm system I'd armed every single night without exception. Part 4. Delphine's Theory. I moved in with my sister Delphine for 2 weeks after that discovery, unable to bring myself to spend another night alone in a house that had proven itself, conclusively, penetrable by someone with resources and patience I couldn't begin to account for. Delphine, always the more methodical of the two of us, spent those 2 weeks doing her own quiet research, and I want to describe the theory she eventually presented to me, because I think it changed the entire shape of how I understood what was happening to me. I remember those 2 weeks at her apartment with a strange, guilty fondness, actually, despite everything, the specific comfort of not being alone, of falling asleep to the sound of another person moving quietly through an adjoining room, of waking without that first, instinctive scan of my surroundings for anything out of place. Delphine never once made me feel like a burden during that stay, never once suggested I was overreacting, and I think that steady, unwavering belief in the seriousness of what was happening to me did more for my actual sense of safety during those 2 weeks than any lock or camera ever had. "I don't think this is random," she said, sitting across from me at her kitchen table one evening, a legal pad covered in her small, careful handwriting between us. "I think whoever's doing this knew you before any of this started. The chair wasn't moved to scare you in some generic way, it was turned to face the door, which means whoever did it wanted you to feel watched specifically when you came home, which means they know your habits well enough to predict exactly when and how you'd notice. The camera gap wasn't random either. 11 minutes is oddly specific. I think that's exactly as long as it took someone who already knew your camera's exact placement to adjust it, do whatever they needed to do, and put it back." She'd made a timeline, spread across 3 pages of that legal pad, cross-referencing every incident against my own known schedule, looking for patterns in when things happened relative to when I was reliably away from the house. I remember being struck, looking at her careful annotations, by how much genuine investigative rigor she'd brought to something that had, until that point, existed for me mostly as a formless, undifferentiated dread. Delphine had turned my fear into data, into something with edges and patterns I could actually examine rather than simply endure. I asked her, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, who she thought could possibly have that kind of specific knowledge of my habits and my home, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering, clearly reluctant to voice a suspicion she knew would be difficult for me to hear. "Has anything happened with Roland recently?" she asked, finally, and I felt my whole body go cold hearing his name. Roland was an ex-partner from nearly 3 years earlier, a relationship that had ended, on the surface, amicably enough, no dramatic confrontation, no restraining order. Simply a slow drift apart that I'd always attributed to ordinary incompatibility rather than anything more troubling. But Delphine, who'd never fully trusted him even during our relationship, reminded me of details I'd mostly let myself forget in the years since, his specific, persistent interest in my daily routines. Framed at the time as simple attentiveness rather than surveillance, his unusual comfort with locks and security systems, a skill he'd always attributed to a summer job in his 20s I'd never had any reason to doubt, and the specific, unsettling way our relationship had ended, not with any argument, but with him simply, gradually withdrawing in a manner that had felt, even at the time, less like genuine disinterest and more like someone choosing to step back into shadow rather than fully leave. I hadn't spoken to Roland in over 2 years. I had no evidence connecting him to anything happening in my house. But Delphine's theory settled into my chest with a weight that felt, disturbingly, like recognition rather than mere suspicion, and I found myself, over the following days, unable to fully dismiss it no matter how hard I tried. Lying awake running through half-remembered details of our relationship, wondering how many of them I'd misread at the time as simple affection rather than something considerably more calculated. Part 5. The Note. I returned to my own house after those 2 weeks, against Delphine's careful, repeated advice, because I couldn't reasonably impose on her life indefinitely, and because some stubborn part of me refused to be permanently driven out of a home I'd worked so hard to earn. I upgraded my security system further, added a second, independently monitored camera system as backup, and began, deliberately, varying my daily routine in ways I hoped would make me a harder target to predict, different routes home. Different grocery stores, small, exhausting acts of unpredictability that I maintained with a discipline I hadn't known I possessed. For nearly 3 weeks, this seemed to work. And then, on a Thursday evening, I found the note. It was tucked into my mailbox, alongside my ordinary mail, no envelope, no postage, meaning it had been placed there directly rather than delivered through any conventional postal service, a single sheet of plain paper, folded in thirds. With a handful of typed lines that I have read so many times since that I can recite them from memory without needing to look at the copy I eventually gave to investigating detectives. I remember standing at the end of my driveway that evening, ordinary mail still in one hand, this folded sheet in the other, feeling the specific, plummeting drop of my stomach that comes when you already know, before you've even unfolded something, that it's going to change everything. You changed your routine. I noticed. I want you to know I'm not upset about it. I actually think it's smart, and I respect that you're being careful. I just need you to understand that being careful and being safe are 2 different things, and I don't think you're actually as safe as you've convinced yourself you are. I'm not trying to frighten you. I'm trying to help you understand your situation clearly. I'll be in touch again soon. I stood there, in my own driveway, in full daylight, reading and rereading those lines, and I want to describe the specific, layered horror of that note, because I think it's different in kind from the horror of the earlier incidents. The chair had been unsettling because it suggested presence. The camera gap had been unsettling because it suggested capability. But the note was the first piece of evidence that suggested something considerably worse than either intention, articulated, patient, and, in its own twisted way, almost tender. The specific horror of realizing that whoever was doing this to me genuinely believed themselves to be acting reasonably, even kindly, rather than committing an act of sustained terror against a woman who had never once invited any of it. I called the police immediately, and this time, the note itself, physical evidence, undeniably real, impossible to dismiss as simple imagination or misremembered furniture placement, finally moved my case into a different category of official attention. A detective was assigned, fingerprint analysis was conducted, and I want to be honest that the note, for all its horror, brought with it a strange, complicated relief, for the first time since the invoice with its unexplained third key. I finally had something I could point to that other people, professionals whose job was to be believed, couldn't simply explain away. The fingerprint analysis came back inconclusive, smudged, partial, insufficient for a definitive match against any database. But the detective assigned to my case, a careful, thorough woman named Josefina Alderete, took Delphine's theory about Roland seriously enough to actually investigate it, and what she found, over the following 2 weeks, complicated the picture in ways none of us had anticipated. Part 6. What Detective Alderete Found. Roland, it turned out, had moved out of state nearly 18 months earlier, a relocation for work that Detective Alderete confirmed through employment records, lease agreements, and a handful of witness statements from his current coworkers describing his regular, unremarkable presence at a job located well over 1,000 miles from my own house. It was not, on its face, an impossible alibi to circumvent. People travel, people have accomplices, people maintain remote surveillance through means that don't require physical presence, but it was enough to genuinely complicate Delphine's theory, and enough to send Detective Alderete's investigation looking in directions none of us had previously considered. "I don't think we can rule him out entirely," she told me, sitting in my own living room during one of our regular case update meetings, "but I also don't think the physical evidence supports him as directly involved. Whoever's doing this has been inside your house multiple times recently, based on your camera's own timestamps. That takes physical presence, not remote coordination. I think we need to consider that this might be someone with more current, more local access to your life than an ex-partner who's been out of state for a year and a half." She walked me through a list of considerations I found genuinely difficult to sit with: anyone who'd had legitimate access to my house during the past year, contractors, delivery services, anyone who might have observed my locksmith's original service call closely enough to arrange for that third key to be cut without my knowledge. I remember sitting with her, going through my own calendar for the preceding 14 months, trying to reconstruct every single person who'd had any reason to be inside my home: a plumber called out for a leaking pipe, a cable technician, a friend's boyfriend who'd helped move furniture one weekend, the original locksmith's technician himself, each name feeling, as I said it aloud, like a small betrayal of trust one hadn't previously known I'd need to guard so carefully. I found myself, over the following days, looking at nearly everyone in my life with a suspicion that felt, increasingly, like its own kind of exhausting damage, a corrosion of trust that I think, in some ways, cost me almost as much as the actual physical danger did. I stopped making easy conversation with delivery drivers I'd previously enjoyed a friendly rapport with. I found myself scrutinizing the faces of men on my own street, men I'd waved to for over a year without a second thought, searching for some sign, that I now recognize, looking back. I had no reasonable way of actually identifying, even if it had been there to find. It was Detective Alderete, working through the security company's more detailed technical logs, who found the detail that finally gave the investigation real direction. The 11-minute camera gap I'd discovered weeks earlier was not, it turned out, an isolated incident. Cross-referencing my system's full history against unusual network activity, she identified 4 additional, considerably shorter gaps across the preceding 2 months, none longer than 90 seconds, each one occurring at a time when I was reliably, verifiably out of the house. Someone had been entering my home repeatedly, briefly, with a precision that suggested detailed, ongoing knowledge of my schedule, testing the system's blind spots, learning its patterns, in a slow, patient, almost professional campaign of reconnaissance that had apparently been unfolding for considerably longer than I'd realized. I remember the specific way my hands shook, holding the printed timeline she handed me across my own kitchen table, 5 separate dates circled in red, each one corresponding to an ordinary Tuesday or Thursday I could reconstruct from my own work calendar. Evenings I remembered as entirely unremarkable, having no idea, at the time, that someone had been standing in my kitchen, my bedroom, my hallway, while I sat at my desk 20 minutes away, utterly unaware. "This isn't impulsive," Detective Alderete told me, and I remember the specific gravity in her voice saying it. "This is someone who's treating this like a project. I need you to understand that means we're likely dealing with someone patient enough to keep doing this for a long time if we don't identify and stop them, and I need you to take some additional precautions I'm about to walk you through, starting tonight." Part 7. The night he came for real. The additional precautions Detective Alderete recommended included a temporary relocation to a hotel while investigators installed considerably more sophisticated covert monitoring equipment throughout my house. Equipment designed specifically to catch whoever this was in the act, rather than simply documenting evidence of their presence after the fact. I agreed, reluctantly, exhausted by months of escalating fear, and spent 11 days in an anonymous hotel room across town while detectives quietly transformed my own home into a trap I desperately hoped would finally end this. It worked, though not in any way that felt like triumph in the moment it actually happened. The covert cameras caught him on the 9th night, a man I did not recognize, not Roland, not anyone whose face registered any immediate familiarity at all, letting himself into my house at just past 2 in the morning using a key that fit my current locks perfectly, moving through my home with the calm, practiced ease of someone intimately familiar with its layout despite having, as far as any of us could determine, no legitimate prior access to it at all. I want to describe watching that footage for the first time, sitting beside Detective Alderete in a sparse observation room, because I think it's the moment this account stopped being an abstract, theoretical fear and became something considerably more immediate and more visceral. I remember the exact quality of the black and white infrared image, grainy but unmistakably clear enough to make out his face, his build, the specific, unhurried confidence of his movement through my front hallway, a stranger's face that I searched desperately for any flicker of recognition, any half-remembered encounter that might at least explain how someone I'd apparently never consciously met had come to know my home this intimately. Nothing came. He was, as far as my own memory could tell me, a complete stranger, and somehow that anonymity made the footage considerably more frightening than if I'd recognized him instantly. Because it meant this violation had been built entirely out of observation I'd never once noticed happening. He moved through my kitchen first, opening drawers with a familiarity that suggested he'd done this many times before, pausing at my refrigerator to examine photographs held there with magnets, pictures of Delphine, of friends, of my late parents, lingering on each one with an attention that made my skin crawl watching it secondhand through a screen. I remember Detective Alderete's hand on my shoulder at that moment, a small, steadying gesture I was grateful for, because watching him linger over a photograph of my mother, gone now for 6 years, touching the frame gently with one gloved finger before moving on, produced a specific, violating grief that I hadn't anticipated needing to brace myself against. He moved into my bedroom next, and I want to be honest that I asked Detective Alderete to stop the footage at that point, unable to watch further, though she assured me, gently, that nothing more overtly threatening occurred in the remaining recorded minutes. Simply more of the same slow, patient, deeply violating familiarity with a space that was mine and had never been offered to him. She told me, later, once I'd found the composure to ask, that the remaining footage showed him sitting, briefly, on the edge of my bed, in a posture she described, carefully, as closer to contemplative than aggressive. A detail that has haunted me since almost more than any imagined violence could have, the specific, unbearable intimacy of a stranger simply sitting in the quiet dark of my own bedroom as though he belonged there. Detectives moved that same week, using the footage and a partial license plate captured by a neighbor's doorbell camera as he left, to identify him, a man named Desmond Achterberg, 38, employed, at the time, as a technician for the very security company I'd hired to install my original system after the chair incident months earlier. I want to describe the specific, sickening clarity of that discovery, because I think it explains, retroactively, nearly everything that had confused and terrified me for months. He had installed my system himself, had access to its every technical specification, had known, from the very first professional visit to my home, exactly how to move through and around the very defenses I'd trusted to protect me. I remember Detective Alderete showing me his employee file photograph and the specific, disorienting recognition that finally arrived, seeing his face in ordinary daylight rather than grainy infrared. I had met him once, briefly, during the original installation appointment, a polite, unremarkable man who'd walked me through my new system's features with what I'd registered, at the time, as simple professional thoroughness. I had thanked him. I remembered with a fresh wave of nausea, offered him a glass of water while he worked, a small, ordinary kindness that I now understood, with the clarity of hindsight, had likely been the exact moment his attention had first fixed on me. Part 8. What Achterberg Said. Desmond Achterberg was arrested 9 days after that footage was captured, and I want to be honest that his eventual statement to investigators, portions of which Detective Alderete shared with me during the case's later proceedings, disturbed me almost as much as anything he'd actually done inside my house. He had, according to his own account, first noticed me during that original security system installation nearly a year earlier, and had described, in language that investigators found genuinely, clinically unsettling, developing what he called a connection to me over the following months, one he insisted, throughout his interviews, was never intended to frighten me, but rather to slowly, carefully demonstrate a level of attentiveness and care he believed I would eventually come to appreciate. Once I understood it fully. He had cut the third key during that very first service call, months before I'd ever have reason to suspect anything at all, using access to my home that I had, at the time, offered freely and without any hesitation. Trusting him precisely because his company's uniform and credentials had signaled exactly the kind of professional legitimacy designed to earn that trust. Detective Alderete told me, reading through portions of the transcript with me, that he had described this initial act with a genuine, unsettling pride, framing it not as theft or violation, but as a kind of foresight, a way of ensuring, in his words, that I'd always have a way to check on her if something ever seemed wrong, as though the entire justification for stalking a woman he'd met once, professionally, for under an hour, was some warped notion of caretaking rather than the sustained assault it actually was. He described moving my chair not as an act of intimidation, but as what he called, in a phrase that still makes my stomach turn recalling it, an invitation to notice him, a first, careful step in a courtship he genuinely seemed to believe I would eventually recognize and reciprocate, if only he demonstrated enough patience, enough attentiveness, enough proof of how thoroughly and carefully he'd studied every detail of my life. He described the camera gaps in similarly disturbing language, telling investigators he'd simply wanted a little privacy during his visits, as though the specific horror of a stranger repeatedly entering a woman's home while she was absent were a matter of etiquette rather than crime. The note, he explained, had been intended as reassurance rather than threat, his own words, verbatim, according to the transcript Detective Alderete eventually shared with me, described it as clarifying my intentions so she wouldn't waste any more energy being afraid of the wrong things. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment, because I think it captures something genuinely essential about the specific horror of what happened to me. A horror considerably different from the more overtly supernatural or violent accounts I've heard from others who've lived through their own versions of sustained terror. There was no entity here, no curse, no ancient malevolence, simply a man, entirely human, entirely capable of holding a steady job and passing as an ordinary, unremarkable member of my community, who had convinced himself, over months of escalating intrusion, that violating my safety and my privacy in ever more intimate ways constituted a reasonable, even romantic, campaign rather than the sustained assault it actually was. Detective Alderete told me that when investigators finally confronted him with the footage of himself sitting on the edge of my bed, he'd shown, for the first time in any of his interviews, something resembling genuine embarrassment, not, she was careful to clarify, remorse for what he'd done to me, but a kind of social discomfort at having his private, careful fantasy exposed to strangers in a windowless interview room, a distinction that told her, and eventually told me, everything I needed to understand about how little of his behavior had ever actually been about me as a real, autonomous person at all, rather than as a carefully curated idea he'd built and maintained largely inside his own head. He is currently awaiting trial, held without bail given the court's assessment of ongoing risk, and Detective Alderete has told me, honestly, that his defense is likely to lean heavily on exactly the kind of framing he offered investigators. A misguided but fundamentally nonviolent pursuit of connection, rather than a deliberate campaign of terror. An argument I find almost unbearably infuriating given everything it costs me to simply exist safely in my own home for the better part of a year. Part 9. What's left? I sold the house on Alder Court 4 months ago, unable to convince myself that any amount of new security, any number of changed locks, could fully restore the sense of safety that home had once represented for me. I remember the specific grief of that final walkthrough with a real estate agent, running my hand along the hallway wall I'd painted myself the summer I moved in, looking out at the garden I'd built from neglected soil into something genuinely thriving. Understanding that I was leaving behind not just a structure, but years of careful, hopeful investment in a version of my life that Achterberg's patient, methodical violation had made permanently unrecoverable, regardless of how the eventual trial resolved. I live now in a different city entirely, in a smaller apartment I chose specifically for its lack of any obvious selling points that might have originally drawn Achterberg's attention to me in the first place. No charming original hardware requiring a specialist locksmith, no security system requiring a technician's intimate access, small, deliberate choices meant to minimize the number of strangers who ever have legitimate reason to learn my home's specific vulnerabilities. I know, rationally, that this kind of careful minimization cannot fully guarantee anything, that determined harm can find its way through almost any precaution given enough patience, but I've found that the illusion of control, however incomplete, is sometimes the only thing standing between me and a paralysis I can't afford to let myself fall into. I still see a therapist regularly, working through what she's described, carefully, as a form of sustained hypervigilance that will likely take considerable time to fully resolve, if it ever fully resolves at all. I check my own locks obsessively, still, even in a building with a doorman and considerably more conventional security than my old house ever offered. I've stopped, mostly, being able to trust the specific, easy comfort of coming home to an empty space, a loss that I think, honestly, might be the single most permanent thing Achterberg actually took from me, more lasting than any of the individual incidents themselves. My therapist has told me, gently, that recovery from this kind of sustained violation rarely looks like a clean return to who I was before it started, that the more realistic, achievable goal is learning to build a genuinely full life alongside the changes it left behind, rather than waiting for those changes to simply disappear. Delphine and I are closer now than we've ever been, and I credit her, genuinely, with saving my life in ways I don't think I've ever adequately thanked her for, her refusal to simply accept the mundane explanations I initially reached for. Her insistence on taking my growing fear seriously long before I had any concrete evidence to justify it, her steady, careful research that eventually gave Detective Alderite's investigation its first real direction. I think, without her, I might have talked myself out of taking this seriously for considerably longer than I actually did, and I don't know, honestly, how much longer I would have survived that delay. We speak nearly every day now, small, ordinary check-ins that have become their own quiet ritual, a way of confirming, gently, that the world on the other end of the line is still exactly as safe as it's supposed to be. I've also, in the months since, connected with 2 other women through a support group Detective Alderite recommended, both of whom lived through their own versions of sustained patient stalking by men who genuinely believed themselves to be engaged in some warped form of courtship rather than crime. I want to mention this because I think it matters. This is not, whatever any individual perpetrator's defense might argue, some rare, isolated aberration. It is a pattern, common enough that a support group exists specifically to hold space for it, common enough that Detective Alderite, in her years on the force, told me she's investigated some version of this same story more times than she could easily count. If there's a single piece of advice I can offer anyone reading this, it's this. Trust the specific, physical evidence of your own home over any explanation, however reasonable sounding, that asks you to doubt what you're actually observing. A moved chair. A missing key. A gap in your own security footage that no one can quite explain. These are not, whatever anyone tells you, too small to matter. I ignored the first small wrongness in my own house for nearly 3 weeks, telling myself I was being reasonable rather than paranoid, and I have spent every day since wishing I had trusted that first, quiet unease considerably sooner than I did. Check your locks. Trust the wrongness you notice, however small. Tell someone, even if you're not yet certain it's worth telling. And never, ever assume that safety, once established, is something you get to stop actively protecting.